Hello, freak bitches. Now you've got a documentary out that you're working
Yeah.
on as well.
Yeah, well, it's out. No, it's airing on Sunday. It's called Hell on Earth. It's about the Syrian Civil War and the rise of ISIS, and it's out on National Geographic Channel, 9 Eastern, 8 Central, this Sunday.
This Sunday.
Yeah.
Is it going to be available? I mean, you can obviously watch it at the time, but is it going to be available on Netflix or Apple TV or something like that, where people
I think
can download
eventually,
it?
yeah. It's I haven't even thought that far ahead. I mean, it's owned by National Geographic, so I don't quite know how they're. I'm sure you'll be able to get it on their website at some point, but it's airing on Sunday.
And what was your experience doing that?
Well, I was home writing Tribe, actually, and so I wasn't overseas. You couldn't really get into Syria anyway. I mean, it was a suicidal thing to do. So what we did, my colleague Nick, the guy who was here earlier, we basically sort of worked the border areas around Syria, looking for people who were living in Syria, who knew people in Syria who could shoot for us. And we found some very, very brave people who documented their lives under ISIS, their lives with the Free Syrian Army. There was a lot of combat. And we accumulated about 1,000 hours of footage and interviews we did with experts. And we put together Hell on Earth, trying to explain how really quite peaceful democratic protests turned into violent demonstrations and finally into a civil war. And of course, it was the repressive government. I mean, people protest in the street and they're met with machine gun fire, and eventually civilians are going to get some machine guns themselves and fight back, and that's how you get a civil war.
How do you take thousands of hours like that and boil it down to one show?
Well, it's very, very hard. I mean, that's what filmmaking is, and it's figuring out what's the 1% that goes into the film and how do I structure it.
How much time does it take to do something like that?
We had a really good. I mean, this is the first I've made. This is my 5th film. Most of the films I've made, it was me and an editor and another person in the room or whatever. This, we had a big team. And so we had some very, very smart young people who were going through all this footage and categorizing it. Like, here, this is a section about, this material is about, whatever, escaping ISIS. And this is about trying to find food, whatever. They would sort of put it into categories. And then I would start to look through some of that material and we could gradually sort of build a structure.
The situation in Syria seems to be, from someone who just hasn't studied it that much, but just looks at it from the outside, one of the bleaker, darker situations that we have here in the world.
I mean, it's the tragedy of this generation, I think. Over 400,000 Syrians, mostly civilians, have died. The equivalent death toll in this country would be, I think, 7 or 8 million Americans, the sort of equivalent amount of people. And half the country, half the Syrian population has been displaced from their homes, and millions are outside the country's borders in Europe and even in this country.
What did you take out of the documentary? I mean, it seems like no one has a solution for Syria.
No, I mean, civil wars are tough that way. I think ISIS eventually is going to be defeated on the battlefield. They're going to be eradicated, and I hope they are, because they're a ghastly, brutal group. And Assad, who's killed way more people than ISIS, he just didn't do it publicly like they did. He's the leader of Syria, president of Syria. He's propped up by Iran and by Russia, and so he's not going anywhere. I mean, if you have those two countries as your allies, like, you're not going anywhere. So I think what's going to happen ultimately is that ISIS will be defeated and the country will be partitioned along sectarian lines. And eventually there may be a kind of delicate peace.
It seems like with all those Middle Eastern countries, well, any country that's run by a brutal dictator, as soon as that dictator's removed or as soon as somebody dies, there's this massive power vacuum.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that would be the argument for not trying to remove him. I mean, he's a complete criminal and sadist, and he's horrible. But,
what was the argument for keeping Saddam Hussein in power? It was the argument for keeping Gaddafi in power?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's sort of utilitarian argument, from John Stuart Mill, like what's going to cause the least human suffering or promote the most human happiness, and sometimes. I can understand the reasoning behind, look, the guy's a dictator, but we should leave him in place, because the alternative is a lot of other innocent people suffering when we remove him and the country collapses. This country has already collapsed, so the question is, okay, we make a tentative peace deal with him. We'll leave you in power. We won't try to topple you, but let's stop fighting. I mean, I could support that. Yeah, personally.
Wow, isn't that crazy? The idea of keeping that guy in power
Yeah.
just so less people suffer. You keep a brutal, murderous dictator in power,
Yeah,
and we're better off that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, the war killed almost 500,000 people. So
Yeah.
if you want that to continue, like,
Right.
those are the awful moral choices.
It's very frustrating for people though, because they would like to see we'd like to see some solution like on the table, but that doesn't seem like a solution.
Well, it's a solution to the violence,
Right.
right? I mean, any peace deal is a solution to the violence. So, and the first thing that has to happen, I think, is that the violence stops so that people stop dying. The pursuit of justice is important, but it's a secondary matter after that.